Hopefully you should be seeing the title slide there.
Yep, looks good.
Excellent, great, thank you. So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to present some of the work that we've done over the years. As Tom mentioned, I've been here for about 20 years doing research. The title of the presentation this evening is Past, Present, and Future of Seagrasses in Yaquina Bay and Other West Coast Estuaries. And so the primary focus is going to be within Yaquina, but we're also going to talk about a few other places up and down the west coast of North America. Let's see. Okay. There we go. So this is obviously not work that is just mine. There's been a large contingent of scientists at the EPA facility here for a long time. And many of these colleagues we've published together and worked together for a long time. There's a photograph here in the center showing many of the people who contributed data or research that has helped to really understand sort of what's going on in a lot of these systems. Many of them have since retired, but a lot of this work was conducted while Walt Nelson, shown here in the upper left, was our branch chief. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that there was a lot of folks that have contributed over the years to this work. So getting into the presentation a little bit, this is a sort of outline of what I'll be discussing this evening, sort of Seagrass 101. What is a seagrass? Why do we care? We'll talk a little bit about the plants that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. And then we'll start looking at some changes in distribution of Zoster Marina and Zaustra Japonica, the non-native seagrass that we have. Talk a little bit about drivers of change, and then at the very end, I've got some suggestions of what I think some future research needs are. So what are seagrass? Seagrasses are flowering plants. They're monocots in the order Alismatales. They have true roots, stems, and leaves. They have xylem and phloem, so they move water and photosynthate through these very specialized tissues. And they're highly adapted to the marine environment. They're obligate halophytes. That means they need to live in salt water. They have what's called hydrophilus pollination. So basically they exchange pollen, but all of that is done completely underwater. They set seeds underwater. All of their entire life history is completed underwater. They have thin, flexible, strap-like leaves that sort of move around in the water column. And they have this really cool system called Arancoma. And this is basically a system of straws that goes from the very tip of the leaves all the way down to the very tip of the roots. And it allows the plants to live in yucky anoxic sediments. And it allows them to actually get oxygen from the photosynthetic tissue in the leaves to all the way down into the roots, which are sitting in this anoxic mud. And these are some photographs here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but outlining this upper photograph shows the Arancoma, these air channels that are throughout the whole plant. And then this lower panel you can see on the right-hand side here, these are pollen grains that have been released from the male flowers and would go to fertilize the female flowers and create seeds. So that's just a little bit about what seagrasses are and why do we care about them? Well, they provide a series of very important estuarine ecosystem services. This is a critical habitat for a variety of birds and animals and fish. And they also remove nutrients from the water column, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, fertilizers. They remove carbon. They're important for carbon sequestration. And that carbon is actually concentrated and gets stored in the sediments and taken out of the biosphere. And so it's sequestered. And then there's also sorts of fish and animals that utilizes habitat. Ducks that feed on the plants directly. It's used for herring spawn. They'll lay their eggs on the eelgrass plants. There's all sorts of fish that live in the eelgrass beds, including salmon and other fishes as well. So they're a really important habitat within our estuaries. And they're a really important sentinel species that's used for sort of determining whether or not water quality is good or poor. So in the Pacific Northwest, we have 6 species of seagrass. 3 of them, the 3 phyllospatic species that are shown on the bottom, occur only on the outer coast in rocky intertidal tide pools and that sort of thing. Rupia marittima tends to be brackish, occurring in some of our marshes and areas of low salinity. And then the other 2 species, Zoster marina and Zaustra japonica, which I'm really going to focus on today, occur more throughout the estuary and within the estuaries. So this is just a couple of photographs showing these 2 plants. Just for reference, I'm about 5'10", 5'11", something like that. And that's about 180 centimeters. So these plants can be pretty tall. The eelgrass plants, 30 to 120 centimeters in length. Usually they can get a little bit longer than that. We've seen some here growing up to 2 meters, but not all the time. They tend to be about 12 millimeters in width, about ½ an inch. And then we'll have shoot densities on the order of 60 to 140 shoots per meter squared. Reasonable biomass around 300 or 30 to 200 grams dry weight per meter squared. And they tend to occur in the lower intertidal. So they occur from about -6 feet to about plus 1.5 feet relative to mean lower low water. So down around those zero tides, you see those zero tides and you see a big eelgrass bed. That's the area where the Zaustra marina is. Zaustra japonica, on the other hand, tends to be much, much smaller. This white ruler here is a 6-inch ruler. So it kind of gives you a difference in the idea of the difference in scale of the size of the plants. They tend to be much, much denser, 2,000 to 10,000 shoots per meter squared. But interestingly, they have very similar biomass. And they occur much higher in the intertidal, up around +3 feet to about +6 feet. So they occur as disjunct populations here in Yaquina Bay, but in some places they actually do coexist and commingle in some beds. We have a pretty good idea about a lot of their physiological optima and tolerances, and I'm not really going to go through all of this in any sort of nitty-gritty detail. I just wanted to provide you an idea that after 40 years of research on these plants, we've got a pretty reasonable idea of how they're going to respond to basic environmental drivers like light, temperature, salinity, and nutrients. But we're still learning a lot about those plants and how some of those factors interact and to influence the plant community. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on anything like that. This is the only graph I'm going to show because it becomes important later on as we continue into this presentation. So these 2 figures, the one on the left shows photosynthesis as a function of temperature. And I've included temperature in Fahrenheit for those of you who aren't used to thinking in Celsius. Those are the red numbers there, are the temperatures in Fahrenheit. And what I want you to take away from these 2 figures is that as temperature increases, the respiration rate increases faster than photosynthesis. And so that becomes really important later on in this presentation. It's sort of the take-home message here is that temperature has a large impact on the plant carbon budget and how these plants fix the balance of respiration and photosynthesis. Just for sort of to put things in context, most of the water temperatures here in Yaquina Bay are typically on the order of between about 8 and 15 degrees C. So they're pretty cold in that 50 to 60 degree temperature range. We'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go along. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say. So this is an underwater photograph of Zaustra Marina that was taken in OSU Cove a couple of years ago, just to kind of show you what it looks like underwater when you see these plants. And we're going to sort of focus on Zaustra Marina here for a little bit and look at the locations of some large-scale losses of Zaustra Marina beds. This map on the right-hand side shows basically the seagrass distribution along the entire west coast of North America. And we're going to look at a few different places in Westcott Bay, Washington, Coos Bay in Oregon, and then down in Morro Bay in California. So Westcott Bay, Washington, this is in the San Juan Islands. Between 2001 and 2003, there was a loss of about 50 acres of eelgrass that just disappeared, totally gone. This area in the orange is essentially is the mapping of the seagrass beds that disappeared. The cause has never been, for that loss has never been identified, and restoration efforts that were tried in there were completely not successful. And I should mention that this is based on work from Washington Department of Natural Resources. Since the early 2000s, they've done annual monitoring throughout the Puget Sound Basin for eelgrass mapping. And this was one of their study sites that basically disappeared. So in Morro Bay, California, they've had consistent mapping efforts since 2002, so pretty much every year since 2002. And then they had a range of historical estimates of eelgrass area within the bay. And from 1970 to 1994, it was roughly 400 acres of eelgrass that were known to be in the system. Between 1995 and 2010, that ranged from about 125 to 340 acres. And then from 2007 to 2016, there was a 90% decline in eelgrass coverage in the system. And in 2013, they actually estimated that there was 15 acres of eelgrass left. I should point out that in the figure on the right-hand side, the red areas are the areas that were eelgrass, and you can see that they're mapped from 2007, 2009, 2010, 2013, 2017, and fall of 2019. In 2017, they started seeing a little bit of colonization, natural recolonization occurring, and they have started doing some restoration efforts in 2019. However, I don't think that any of that has been very successful, and they're still at around this very low level of eelgrass still being present within the system. And again, there was no monitoring going on at the time, so they really don't know, or water quality monitoring, I'm going to phrase that. So they really don't know what the causative factor was that caused this eelgrass loss. All right, lost my cursor here. There we go. So in the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve, this is down in Coos Bay. They've also been doing eelgrass monitoring for quite a long time, annual monitoring since 2004. This is at the Volino Island, has been sampled quarterly as part of the Seagrass Net site, and I'll talk more about seagrass at the end of Seagrass Net at the end of this presentation. Prior to 2016, eelgrass in Valino had been stable for at least 11 years. So it was, the populations were doing fairly well. And then in 2016, they noted a little bit of a decrease in cover and density. And between 2016 and 2019, there was a 51% loss of eelgrass. And that's what's shown in this, these figures on the far right. The bright green mass there is the eelgrass in 2016 at the top. And in 2019, you can see that there's still eelgrass present, but it's very much reduced and very patchy. So there's been a pretty good size loss of eelgrass there in South Slough as well. Okay. There. So we're going to just jump back up to Puget Sound again for a minute. As I mentioned before, Washington DNR has been doing monitoring in Puget Sound for a very long time. All of these dots on the right-hand side represent sampling locations, and they're color-coded in decline, increase, or no trend, and then limited data and no grass. But what I wanted to really sort of point out here was that during the 2016-2017 monitoring season, there were several hotspots that were identified. And these were primarily in the San Juan Islands, these red dots that I've outlined in the yellow circles at the top. And then also in the central Puget Sound area, very much directly across from Seattle, that second cluster of red dots there. And one of the interesting things that they noted in their report in 2016-2017 was that it was likely related to the unusual environmental conditions that were observed in 2016. And that sort of got me thinking about, what's going on here. So also a little bit to the north, in Sequim, Washington, there's a long-term growth monitoring site at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL, in Sequim, and they documented the loss of about 700 square meters of seagrass that occurred during the blob. If many of you will remember, there was a marine heat wave, and we had some very warm temperatures, water temperatures for quite a while. And there were similar trends that were observed by Washington DNR at the Jamestown site, also out on the Olympic Peninsula. And there were large flocks of Canada geese that were observed foraging in this area. So you might be wondering, okay, what does this have to do? What do these losses have to do with, in other bays? What do they have to do with Yaquina Bay? Well, all of these observations got me thinking about what's going on here in Yaquina. And a colleague mentioned that they had driven across the bridge and looked over, and the eelgrass bed seemed really small. So this is a photograph from Idaho Flat in February of 2002 that I took. This is actually a digital photo of a print that we didn't have many digital cameras then. And it shows a transect, a 50-meter long transect going from the water up to the very top of the eelgrass bed. This was a 0-0 tide. So it was the low tide was right at that 0-0 watermark. And this was the bed was pretty extensive. 50 meters is 164 feet. And then it extended another probably 20 to 30 meters into the bay to a depth of about 2 meters. So the little flags represent 10-meter intervals. But basically, this is just to sort of show you historically what the eelgrass beds look like here in parts of Yaquina Bay. I took this photograph in April of 2021. This is a different research area, but it had historically had a very wide eelgrass bed. This tide was a minus 1.6 foot tide, and the depth of the eelgrass bed is greatly reduced. So where you can see the water goes from sort of smooth to a little bit more ripply, that's about the deep edge of the seagrass bed. And then it's probably only about, I don't know, probably 10 meters up from where the water level is right now, and shown in that photograph. So it's drastically reduced from what I remembered it, you know, and just looking at it anecdotally, it's kind of like, this is really small, but that's not a quantitative estimate. And so I went back, and we had done a lot of mapping in eelgrass mapping in our lab. David Young in particular had done a lot, and Pat Clinton had done a lot of seagrass maps of Yaquina and other estuaries as well. And so I went back and started looking at their maps, and this is one of their maps. The bright green is classified as Zaustra Marina in 2007 from that mapping program. And then you'll see there's a pink line on there. And that pink line represents a GPS trail that I walked in 2021, right along the upper edge of the eelgrass bed on a good low tide. So it represents the upper margin of eelgrass. And I walked from the Marine Science Center seawater intake down almost to the entrance or almost to the end of Idaho Point in that transect. And what you'll notice is there's a lot of bright green that's up above that pink, that is shoreward of that pink line. And all of that is gone. That eelgrass doesn't exist anymore. And when you blow it up and look at that insert, and I kind of wish I had a pointer, but it doesn't seem to be showing up here. But you'll see the yellow and blue dots. Those were places that I had GPS coordinates that were the upper and lower margins of the eelgrass bed back in 2005, I think it was. 2002 and 2005. And you can see that those places are areas that are no longer have seagrass. And so probably in some places, 50 to 70% of the eelgrass within Yaquina is gone. And that sort of what got me thinking about some of this. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Zaustra japonica, dwarf eelgrass or Japanese eelgrass. This is the non-native seagrass that we have locally and throughout the Pacific Northwest. And this is a photograph of it underwater again in OSU Cove. So Japonica was introduced with oyster aquaculture between about 1900 and about oyster imports ended in 1980. There was a fairly large hiatus there during World War II where there were no imports, but there was oyster imports to the Pacific Northwest from Japan occurred throughout that whole time frame. The first Zaustra japonica was first collected in Willapa Bay in 1957. It was then found in Puget Sound at Boundary Bay in 1974, 1975. In 1978 in the Fraser River, 1979 in Vancouver Island. 1976 it was found in Yaquina Bay, and it's still here. In Humboldt, and in 2002 it was found as far south as California, in Humboldt Bay. We're going to look at this a little bit more in depth. This is some mapping work that was done by David Young, published by him. In 1998, there was about 1 square kilometer of Zaustra Marina, that bright green. But you'll notice in the upper edges there along Sally's Bend, there was a little bit of red being the Zaustra japonica. There's a little bit of it around Idaho Point. And by 2007, there had been quite an expansion of Zaustra japonica. It had gone from about 3.7 hectares to about 19 hectares. So quite a big increase, and very, very common within the Sally's Bend portion of the estuary, and also along Idaho Point. This slide in the upper right shows in some black dots that were mapped as Zaustra japonica along Idaho Point in June of 2000. And then white points that are shown there as well that were mapped as Zaustra japonica in 2014. And that is went from about 0.09 hectares to about 0.7 or 0.57 hectares, which is about a 600% increase over a 14-year time span. So it was definitely doing well and taking off. So what's going on now? These are photographs taken at the same place. This is Idaho Flat or Idaho Point. That tree in the left-hand photograph, the 2002 labeled one, that tree there directly abuts against the road. You can see there was a large Zaustra japonica bed there. In 2009, there was still quite a bit of Zaustra japonica there, and it extended, formed a very nice fringe that went both up and down the shoreline. When I went back in 2021, there was almost no Zaustra japonica there. The green that you see right along the water's edge is all macroalgae that washed up off of the mud flat. There were a couple of Zaustra japonica patches. This is looking back towards the aquarium from Idaho Point. And the areas circled in yellow are calling attention to the small patch of Zaustra japonica that still exists there, or still existed there as of September 28th. So most of the rest of the japonica was gone. I also visited some other field sites. This is Sally's Bend, photograph in 2011, showing my colleague's boots that she pulled out of while we were doing some sampling there. But you can see how dense the japonica is on Sally's Bend in the foreground, with the Yaquina Bay Bridge in the background. Again, September of 2021, I went back, and there is still Zaustra japonica there, but it's very sparse relative to that 2011 photograph. Again, I didn't actually count any of the do shoot counts or anything like that, but just looking at those photographs, the densities are radically different between those two years. And then there's some other places up the estuary that used to be bare mud habitat that now have Zaustra japonica. There are other places up the estuary near Oregon oyster and such that used to have japonica that no longer do. So there's some changes that are occurring or appear to be occurring. And then in Humboldt Bay, we'll talk about japonica in Humboldt Bay in 2010. It was initially discovered in Humboldt in 2002, as I mentioned. California undertook an eradication program to get rid of japonica as an invasive species. They were successful at Indian Island in the area circled with the red circle there. However, they were not successful at a number of other sites, and eventually ran out of money and stopped funding, stopped the eradication process, and stopped monitoring what was going on. They also had data for a number of areas around Humboldt, in Manila, Wallace Ranch, Arcata Marsh, and that. And at the Manila site, between 2009 2010, there was a 50% increase in the number of patches, and a 6-fold increase in the size of the patches. So they were getting more patches and they were getting bigger. At Arcata Marsh in 2010, there were 130 patches that were documented, over 2,000 square meters of area that was infested with Japonica. Up at Arcata Marsh, I guess the previous one was the outer marsh. The inner marsh, they had a 10-fold increase in the number of patches and a 19-fold increase in the size of those patches. And then at the wastewater treatment plant, there was a 4-fold increase in patch number and a 9-fold increase in patch size. So in the mid-2000s or 2010s, Zaustra Japonica was doing pretty darn well. It was expanding and it was pretty happy. In the Eel River estuary in McNulty Slough, that's where this photograph is taken. There was a dense Zaustra Japonica infestation. In 2017, a recon effort by Cow, Fish and Game as part of a research project that I was part of could not find any evidence of Japonica in this particular area. So they did try some experimental eradication work, but that was on a very small scale, and it was not successful. But essentially, the eelgrass or the Japonica disappeared. So in 2017, I did some sampling with colleagues from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is us pictured here. And we went to California to visit some of their field sites. The upper right photograph with a circle, and you can see the PVC post there labeled Manila. That was the biggest Zaustra Japonica patch. It was the only Zaustra Japonica patch we could find in the area. The lower panel photograph is the Arcata wastewater treatment plant site, and all of that is bare sediment. There was no Japonica in there at all. So essentially, Japonica has vanished from Humboldt pretty much on its own. So what the heck is going on? We're seeing these large-scale declines and loss of native eelgrass, Zaustra Marina, up and down the West Coast. We're seeing local changes in Zaustra Japonica. They may be occurring also at large scale. What sorts of things cause eelgrass or seagrass losses and declines? There are a number of things that have been known to kill off seagrass. Two of the biggest ones are wasting disease, which is a marine slime mold that wreaked havoc on Zaustra Marina in the 1930s, and there are places along the Atlantic coast that have never recovered from that. But the monitoring work that's been done out here, yes, there is wasting disease, but not at the levels that would cause large-scale declines in these plants. We're not seeing disease killing off seagrass beds here. Avian overgrazing is another thing. These Canada geese can come in and they can munch down the seagrass pretty darn good. There's been some documented losses of grass beds along the East Coast, but that doesn't really seem to be happening here. I mean, we do see them feeding, but they don't seem to be having a big trend. And that seems to be really sort of localized, so you might see a little bit of a decline in part of a seagrass bed, but the declines that we're seeing are happening at such a huge scale. It's happening at the scale of the entire West Coast. So what else could be causing that? Well, that got me thinking about temperature a lot. We're having this chronic increase in water temperatures that are associated with climate change. The oceans are warming. And then we're also having these episodic warming events, these marine heat waves that have been occurring. The blob, for example, that was, warm water mass that sat offshore for a really long time. And that's what's shown here on the right-hand panels from 2014. And these are continuing to happen. This is a prediction from August of 2021, where they were predicting another warm water mass blob potential sitting off the coast of North America, having a big impact over a huge range. So how do these heat waves line up with sort of or correlate with the seagrass losses that we're seeing? This figure here, I lied, this was the second graph, shows the area of total surface area of all heat waves in square kilometers. But what I'm using it for really is a proxy of when these heat waves occurred. The scale, the x-axis, goes from 1982 to 2021. So pretty good long time scale. And the red bars denote some of these big marine heat wave events. And they really seem to be pretty well correlated with some of the losses. The Japonica loss in Humboldt, the Morro Bay and Volcano Island losses in California and Oregon, the Westcott Bay in early 2000s. There was another heat wave there in '98 that could have had an impact. And then there's something else. There was a publication by Ron Thom and colleagues up at PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab in Sequim, from the Pincer study, which was the, Pacific Northwest Coastal Ecosystems Regional Study. And one of the things that they noted in that work was that in Willapa Bay, there was a decrease in chute density associated with warming waters. So we've got, 5 or 6 of these events that seem to be coupled or, really happening pretty closely to the timing of these marine heat waves. And had gotten me thinking about, how the marine heat waves might be impacting the plants. So the next question is, has this been seen anywhere else? And the answer is yes. This is the Shark Bay World Heritage Site in Australia. And there was a marine heat wave in 2010, 2011 that lasted for 8 weeks, warmed the waters by 4 degrees. That's roughly 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal for 8 weeks, 2 months. And they lost 1,300 square kilometers. That's 500 square miles of seagrass were wiped out by this event. And the map there in red shows the area that was lost, of seagrass that was lost. So one of the interesting things about this was that the chute death occurred, 1 to 2 years after this marine heat wave. So it wasn't an immediate impact. It was something that happened afterwards. And then there's also been extensive seagrass losses along the East Coast and in Europe. And so what I think is going on is this sort of eelgrass mechanistic response to water temperature. And I hope you can see the whole figure here. And so I'm going to take a few minutes and walk through this a little bit. If you think about carbon balance as a bank account for these plants, their deposits are photosynthesis. That's what they're putting into their rhizomes, their storage organ that's the sugar that they're going to use when times get tough. And so that's sort of what I've got going on here. Under optimum conditions, the plants are doing really well. The photosynthesis, the P, is going great. That's what the pluses are all about. There's a little bit of respiration. So, they got to pay their bills. Their bank account is still growing, even though they're paying their bills, because there's more coming in than there is going out. And so they've got net primary productivity is going up. And the sugar the amount of sugar stored in their rhizomes is going up. Basically, you've got really happy plants. they're doing well. They're making little babies and going off. Under some moderate temperature conditions, photosynthesis is still going pretty good. Respiration is a little bit higher now. You know, there's a few more bills to pay. So the bank account is doing okay. It's not, you know, not going gangbusters like it was, but it's not in debt either. And so the plant's kind of fairly happy. As things continue to warm up, though, that photosynthesis is decreasing. So they're not putting as much into the bank now, and respiration is increasing even more. So the bills are there's more going out than there is coming in, and net primary productivity decreases. They're starting to, you know, use up some of that savings that they had, and they're a little worried. And as things get even warmer, basically that trend continues and they ultimately can die, particularly if there's other stressors such as grazing or wasting disease or light limitation. So this is what my working hypothesis of what I think might be going on here. So I'm about ready to wrap this up here in the next couple of minutes, just to let you know. As future research needs, one of the things I think really needs to be done is we need to update the maps of Zaustra Marina and Zaustra Japonica. What is where, how much resource do we have of these resources do we have left, and where do they occur now? And then maybe we might be able to come up with some ideas of why things have changed the way they have. I think it would be great to initiate and maintain a citizen science seagrass monitoring program in Yaquina Bay, something like Seagrass Net. I mentioned that earlier. That was part of the work in the South Slough NERR site that actually documented that loss at Volino Island. It was part of the Seagrass Net. And I'll talk about that in my next slide. I think there needs to be continued research on multiple stressor impacts to seagrasses, and this is something that I do as part of my day job. As a scientist here at Hatfield and working for the EPA, we'll work on multiple stressors, whether that's nutrients or climate change or what have you, and how they interact with the marine environment and habitats. And I think we ought to really prioritize conservation efforts over restoration. Seagrass restoration has a really poor track record. It's very difficult to do. You've got to have the right site, you've got to have the right plants, you've got to have the right conditions. And if any one of those three things isn't happening quite right at the right time, it's just not going to work. And I'd like to note that those are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the agency. So Seagrass Net. This is a citizen science. It's a program that uses data and warehouses data from all over the globe that's collected by researchers and citizen scientists. They're very low tech methods, so it doesn't cost much money to do any of this stuff. Basically a quadrat and transect rope and pretty much you can do this. They've got QA/QC plans, they've got the manual that documents how to do it, they've got data sheets, and basically it's all pretty well laid out for doing this sort of monitoring. They've been doing it now for it's at least 10 years, maybe even longer than, it's going on 20 years, I think. At least 112 sites in 30 different countries around the world. And they've got thousands and thousands of data points and estimates. At this point, I would like to acknowledge my PCEB colleagues again, the folks I've been working with for the last 20 years. As I mentioned, many of them have retired. We've gotten to be a pretty small group these days, but we're still doing good work. I've got a number of other Hatfield colleagues that are interested in seagrass, and we get together and talk, and we've discussed a bunch of the changes that have been noted in this presentation and some others. Yeah, some other colleagues at other institutions. And with that, I'm pretty much done with my presentation. Thank you. See if I can get the cursor over there. You're muted.
Okay, well, what I was trying to say was thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Don't mind reiterating that. Even first is muted. We got a good, healthy discussion going in the chat box. And we'll start off with some Q&A. And I just wanted to say I really like that your presentation actually dovetails really well with some of the other presenters that we've had over the last few months. And so it's sort of by coincidence more than anything that we have a bit of a theme going with the estuary conditions here. And
Awesome.
we had Scott Happel talking about fish, a lot about rockfish in the estuary and how extensively they depend on these eelgrass beds, and Roy Lowe talking about birds and how these ecosystems are important to many of them as well. So it's got great continuity. So we really appreciate that.
Excellent.
Sounds like, yeah, looking at you nodding, you maybe are familiar with some of their work.
Yeah, actually, Scott and I had talked. Unfortunately, I missed his presentation. I really wanted to see it, but I had a conflict and wasn't able to make it. And he and I have wanted to connect to talk about these two presentations, basically, because they seem really to, as you said, dovetail pretty well.
Yeah, there definitely are some links there. I imagine you two could have a lot to talk about. So I wanted to start with a comment that Fawn threw out early on, which she said, I would like to invite all to either present and or attend our Northwest Aquatic and Marine Educators Conference in Netarts, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, on August 6th through 10th, 2022. So something you can put on your
Excellent
calendar if you're interested. Some discussion about science on tap you guys can take a look at in the chat box. Cindy had a number of questions. Let's see, I'm going to kind of compress some of them here. She was asking about the effects, and I think you answered this with your sort of concluding remarks about temperature, but asking about sort of upstream practices such as logging, aerial spray, agriculture runoff. In your research, do you see that those have any impact on eelgrass beds and populations?
So we really have not. That's actually kind of a hard question to answer. So the work that I've been doing has really been focused on the sort of intersection between temperature and nutrients, and how those two drivers influence the seagrass communities. And most of my work has shown that temperature seems to have a bigger impact on the seagrass plants than nutrients per se. And so, you know, when you haven't really looked at herbicides or pesticides or anything along those lines, and haven't really done much with the light side of that. You know, mostly it's been a focus on nutrients and temperature at this point. And like I said, I mean, there's still lots to do and lots to learn about this. It takes me, when I do an experiment, it usually takes about 3 years for me to actually get the data and get it through the whole publication process. So it's a very slow process. So we do see temperature as being a big driver, but haven't really looked at some of the other upstream type issues coming down. One of the things I would say, though, is that nutrients in Yaquina, a lot of the nutrient work that we've done, we have seen switching of nutrient sources from ocean to riverine. And in the winter time, the river is much more dominant in terms of the amount of nitrogen coming down and into the estuary. But that sort of changes with the summer when we get the upwelling and the rains turn off. So the rivers become much less dominant, and most of the nutrients and nitrogen coming into the estuary is actually coming from offshore and not from the watershed. And so that's a whole other wrinkle to put into that, is the seasonality of nutrient sources within the system.
Yeah, fair enough. And I guess one other sort of factor that was part of the question that I kind of omitted, but maybe is worth asking, is about like sedimentation and erosional processes, and just increased deposition, and whether or not there's sort of smothering or erosional processes going on, and that sort of connects with the idea of sea level rise potentially playing a role in all this too, which is sort of one of my questions about it.
Yeah. Gosh, I wish I had a better answer for you. That has not been something that I've looked at personally. I know historically at one point we did do a fair amount of bathymetry type work here in the estuary to get the actual bathymetry to do some of that sort of sea level rise modeling. But that's not work that I was really involved in. And, I mean, anecdotally, I've seen places where it looks like there may be deposition, but I honestly don't know. I don't have any real measurements of that sort of thing.
Okay, fair enough. And that might be a plug. I don't know if Laura Brophy will address that in the presentation, but okay, well, moving on, let's see what Paul Engelmeyer had a question for you. He talks about, he says, brant geese, herring, what other species are linked to eelgrass, and has the decline of herring linked to distribution and abundance of eelgrass? And I understand, do we know what historic distribution and abundance? Also, since we dredge in the Yaquina, could that be a factor in decline? Make of that what you will.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. And so I'll start off with the herring thing. So the herring egg spawn or herring spawn on eelgrass has been documented in Washington, and I think in Oregon. I'm not 100% positive about that. But I know it has been documented up in Washington. Whether or not eelgrass loss is part of the herring decline, I really don't know. Other animals or critters that use the seagrass beds would be salmon, salmonids, and Dungeness crab. I was out low tide just the other, couple of weeks ago now, and there were mating crabs, dungies, in the eelgrass bed. There have been times that I've been out sampling, and just millions and millions of very small Dungeness crab, little baby, Dungeness crab about the size of a dime, just clinging to the eelgrass bed leaves, just coating them. It was really pretty incredible. So there's all sorts of critters that utilize the eelgrass beds. And, it's one of the popular places for clamming, for the gapers, I guess. So there are a lot of animals channels that utilize the seagrass. The dredging, that we definitely dredge Yaquina that is pretty well confined to the deeper portions of the channel. I don't know that they get up, to where the grass beds are. And I honestly don't know. I've not actually dove in the area after a dredging event. The tides tend to move the water out pretty well, the sediment out. So I don't think we get big sediment plumes sitting around or anything like that. And I can't remember, did I cover everything on that, or did I miss anything on that?
I think you pretty much covered it. Unfortunately, I have another hard question for you to follow. Steve asks, what can we do to address the problem?
I'm sorry, you broke up during that?
If heat waves are responsible for the loss of eelgrass, what can we do locally to address the problem? Maybe I'll turn my video off.
Yeah, stop putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That one is a really tough question. There are folks who are looking at genetics, and there are looking at potentially either excuse me, either selectively breeding plants for restoration efforts, or selecting particular strains that seem to be more heat tolerant. On the east coast of North America, in Chesapeake Bay, the water temperatures get up above 28, 29 degrees centigrade, which is in the 90s, I think, high 80s or low 90s there. I don't remember exactly. And when the temperatures get that warm, the plants don't do very well, and many of them will die. But they still have seagrass there. So there is some hope in that we might be able to find some genetic, some populations that are more resilient to the warm water. One of the things about the area that we're in is that we do tend to get the upwelling, and our water temperatures are generally fairly cool. But yeah, what can we do about marine heat waves? I wish I had an answer.
You did mention the kind of citizen science component where you could connect in and at least contribute some data that can help aid potentially in management. That's one way to contribute, it sounds like.
Definitely.
And Paul says again, he says he understands that California and Washington have no net loss of eelgrass. What about Oregon? Do we have that policy here?
I'm not 100% positive. Eelgrass, Zaustra marina, is considered an essential fish habitat. Zaustra japonica is not protected in either California or Washington, and Oregon has no policy whatsoever on Zaustra japonica. But yeah, there are rules about not, if you are impacting Zaustra marina here in Yaquina by a building or something, you're going to have to get permits and mitigate and all sorts of jump through all sorts of hoops to do that, to have minimal impacts. So there definitely is.
Yeah, thanks for that. Couple of praises for your presentation. Very interesting. Lots of good, interesting info. So job well done. Yes, we all agree. Very good. Let's see. A couple more questions, I think. what eradication methods have been tried on the invasive eelgrasses and competitors?
That one is actually really, really interesting. There are some really warped people out there. They, they've done everything from flamethrowers to harrows, plowing it under, covering it with burlap, injecting the sediments with hot water. In Willapa Bay in particular, on commercial properties, they are allowed to use herbicides to remove Zaustra japonica, particularly if they are aquaculture areas that have manila clams. They can get permits to spray the japonica with imazamox or clearcast, which is an herbicide that will just pretty much get rid of it. Yeah, I'm not going to go any further on that one. Let's see, there are other. Yeah, they've done a lot of different things, digging it up and sieving it out. You know, all of which are pretty destructive to a lot of other organisms that live in the intertidal. So my favorite though is the flamethrower.
Yeah. That would be entertaining to watch for sure.
Right.
And another question for you. I can't quite keep up. There's like 18 new messages, so I think we'll have to limit it to maybe 2 or 3 more here. But here's one for you. That's a good question. Do the same species that use Z Marina use Z Japonica?
It depends. So, you know, some of the bird species, definitely. Some of the fish, I think it's probably a little, it's hard to tell. There has been some work trying to look at, you know, what organisms actually use the Zaustra japonica beds and the Zaustra marina beds, and it's been actually pretty difficult to get really good data on that. Brett Dombold has done some video trapping and things like that. And most of the time the water clarity is just so poor that it's very difficult to actually tell what it is or what organisms are there. They have done some trapping type stuff and found, I want to say things like sculpins and that do make it up into the japonica beds. But they're very high up in the intertidal, so there are some differences. There are some differences also in the amphipod communities between the native and non-native seagrass communities. So there's like I said, it kind of depends on what your favorite organism is that you're interested in, or group of organisms.
Fair enough. Okay, there's a question from Cindy that I can answer. She says, are the Midcoast Watershed Council presentations available on the website? Thanks for asking, Cindy, and indeed they are. There was one we missed recently that didn't get recorded, but we are recording this one, and we will do a little bit of editing and then post this on the website before too long as well. So you can find that in the community presentations section on our website. So let your friends know that say, dang, I missed it. You can go find it there. And how about we just end with one more? I'm sure I'm missing some good ones below, but it's getting late. And this also sort of connects with a previous presentation that we had. We had the Alaka Alliance give a presentation on their sea otter restoration efforts. And so the question is, if the Alaka Alliance is successful in restoring historic sea otter populations, do you think that they would help eelgrass populations? New research is suggesting in Elkhorn Slough.
I don't know. I sure as heck hope so. I think that would be really cool. I think it'd be awesome to see otters here in Yaquina, but I honestly don't know. Um, what I've read about that work is, there seems to be a fairly long trophic cascade there. Of, one organism impacts another organism that impacts another one. And so I just don't know if it would work the same here. But I think that would be really cool to find out.
Okay, well, it looks like most of the rest of the comments are, well, there are a lot of questions in there, but unfortunately, I think we'll call it good. Most of the comments are, thank you, great presentation, and many applause. So
thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank
Yeah.
everybody for attending.
I would point out too that if anybody has a burning question, they can contact me by email. I'm happy to take a few minutes and respond.
Great.
Might take me a little while to get to you, but I'll try.
Yep, and we're happy to be middlemen and pass along your contact info if you guys want to reach out to us with said burning question.